Well, Arizona has expanded their "you mean you're not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant" law. Yes. In Arizona, this is from Think Progress, Center for American Progress's website, thinkprogress.org. Arizona supporters of the state's draconian new immigration law insist it has nothing to do with race, isn't meant to discriminate against certain ethnic communities. Right. Today, the Wall Street Journal reports that the Arizona Department of Education, quote, recently began telling school districts that teachers whose spoken English it deems heavily accented or ungrammatical must be removed from classes for students still teaching English. State education officials say the move is intended to ensure that students with limited English have teachers who speak the language flawlessly. But some school principals and administrators say the department is imposing arbitrary fluency standards that could undermine students by thinning the ranks of experienced educators. Bruce Merrill, professor emeritus at Arizona State University, who conducts public opinion research, says this is just one more indication of the incredible anti-immigrant sentiment in the state. Meanwhile, the FBI is looking into possible bribery charges against Massey Energy for trying to, or successfully, bribing mine safety officials in the federal government, particularly during the Bush administration years. Gee, what a surprise. We've talked about Greece under pressure. The one last thing I want to share with you, and then we'll pick. And a piece of breaking news, although we mentioned it earlier that it was probably going to happen. The president has come out and said no new offshore oil drilling until we figure out what the hell's going on here and how this could have been prevented. And I would recommend that he speak with the oil minister of Norway, who was quoted just, 3 days ago? I read the story to you here in the Financial Times as saying, the way we do it in Norway is a whole lot safer, both for the people on the these are my words, not his, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but a whole lot safer both for the people on the oil drilling rigs and for the environment. For example, had there been an automatic cutoff valve as part of the drilling equipment, it would have cost a little more, but when Halliburton was running that drill down into there and it started blowing up, they could have just activated the cutoff switch and basically plugged the well. There would be no oil slick, but Halliburton chose not to do that, or somebody chose not to do that. Chose not to use that technology that is routinely used off the north coast of Norway and off the coast of the UK in offshore oil drilling. So much like Massey Energy and their mining, chose not to have union, in fact, aggressively worked not to have union miners, and therefore not to have a union safety officer in the mines every day looking for safety violations, because, then they'd have to deal with that stuff. And that makes it a little less profitable to get that coal out of the ground. Finally, the Financial Times has a commentator who, Lex, who writes a column that's on the back page of the front section every day. It's called the Lex column. And while I don't always agree with his politics, his insights economically are often brilliant. And from today's Lex column, the main piece, if the U.S. housing market is a barometer, it suggests banks and policymakers should not plan a picnic. Sales volumes have improved, prompting optimism, but today sees the first-time homebuyer tax credit expire. Today is the last day for the first-time homebuyer tax credit, and recent experience suggests it will be followed by a slump in activity. And then he says, in addition to this, housing prices are again falling. And keep in mind what Ravi Batra is pointing out, and this is so important, that economies operate on the basis of supply and demand. And when supply and demand are in sync with each other, it's kind of the Goldilocks economy. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, it's not too big, it's not too small. You have, as supply and demand follow each other, and if you look at the trajectory of supply and demand economically in America, literally from the 1790s until today, what you see is that those numbers only diverge basically during the Civil War and World War II. And then they get right back on track. So as supply goes up, in other words, as productivity increases through the Industrial Revolution, the development of steam power, the development of oil, the development of oil-powered engines, internal combustion engines, and so on, as productivity increased, so did wages. Always. And so as we got more productive in the United States, we got wealthier. And the middle class grew and got stronger. And then came Reaganomics. in the 1980s. And the average working person today is earning about $2,000 less than they were in real inflation-adjusted dollars than they were the day that Ronald Reagan was sworn into office. 30 years of Reaganomics, and the average working person in this country is making less than they were 30 years ago. Which means that the wages have flattened out. Now, wages are what drives demand. And if demand and supply aren't together, you have an economic disaster. So how did, during the Reagan years, the Bush years, during the Clinton years, and even during the initial Bush years, how did they keep demand tracking supply? Because supply, productivity, continued to increase. We got more productive in the United States. The cost of computers and things, fancy stuff, all kinds of things, got less and less expensive to produce. We could produce more and more of them. Productivity went up. Much of our increased productivity was because we were no longer paying so much for labor, because we were buying things from overseas. So you aggregate all that stuff, and what you get is that productivity continued to increase, but demand from wages had flattened out. So how did we boost demand? Well, the way that we did it, and this was part of Greenspan's great fraud, the part of the way that we did it was by saying to people, hey, we're going to give you free credit, cheap credit. Back in the 70s, I remember, I think it was 1974, I got my first American Express card. And at that time, I was running my own business and making more money than my dad, which was a big, big deal for me. And I finally qualified for an American Express card. I was like 23, 24 years old and had been, working in the labor market since I was 16 and working for myself since I was 18 in large part. I was also doing part-time radio, but I had a business. And finally, I was, I could qualify for an American Express. What a big deal. And I still couldn't get a Visa or MasterCard. I mean, it was so hard to get a credit card in the late 60s, early 70s. So what they did was they said, hey, let's give anybody a credit card. And, and anybody who wants to buy a car, they can buy a car on time. And anybody who wants to buy a, new mattress or sofa or whatever, anything you want to buy, we're going to make credit available to you. So from the early Reagan era, from 1981 through the mid-90s, people kept up their lifestyle. That is, demand continued to track supply, because that gap between the two got filled in with debt. Then people ran out of money on their credit cards. And we had the Bankruptcy Reform Act and the Credit Reform Act and all this kind of stuff. And they ran out of money on their credit cards. And so, now we're in the Bush administration and they're freaking out saying, oh my God, people can't borrow money on their credit cards anymore. What are we going to do? Well, let's make it easy for them to borrow money on their house. And so people started using their houses as ATMs, and they would borrow $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 against the equity of their house, which had increased because the value of the house had gone up, because you could easily borrow to buy a house, and you could easily borrow against your house. So this was, creating this giant bubble. So again, that gap between demand, wages, and supply, the amount of stuff out there that you need to maintain your lifestyle and all that kind of stuff, continued to open up, and it was filled by debt. And then housing values collapsed. And people couldn't borrow against their house, and they can't borrow on their credit cards. And there's nothing anymore to bridge that gap. And that's when you get an economic disaster. That's when you get a Great Depression. That's when you get a serious recession. And that's where we're at right now. And the only way to solve the problem is to bring demand back up to where supply is, or bring supply down a little to where demand is. Now, you bring demand up by increasing the minimum wage, increasing unionization, or raising wages. You bring supply down by decreasing imports and making things in the United States, and then the lines converge again.